Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We are so excited to be here with you today, and we're so grateful that you're joining us. I'm your moderator for today. My name is Katina Sawyer. I am the co-founder of Workr, a workplace wellness insights company, as well as an assistant professor of management at the George Washington University School of Business. My area of expertise is in diversity and inclusion, work-life balance, and how to promote positive work environments. And I am here to facilitate a discussion today with Alexander Schwall of Rhabit Analytics and David Shanklin from Google. And so I'm going to kick it over to David to introduce himself a little bit more to us today.
Thanks, Katina. Great to be with you. Hi, David Shanklin. As Katina mentioned, I work for Google and lead a team of people analysts there. My passion is really around creating great organizational cultures and places where people can come alive at work and be their best every day. So it's been really exciting to work with an organization like Rhabit and what they're doing on the from an aspect of feedback. Prior to Google, I spent a decade in the human capital consulting realm, primarily focused on culture and engagement, particularly around data and employees providing feedback to their organizations and to their leaders. So this is a passion point for me. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, absolutely. And Alexander, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
I'd love to. Alexander Schwall. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Rhabit Analytics. That's a title that I gave myself, by the way. That's one of the perks when you start a business. You can be whatever you want to be. I am an industrial organizational psychologist by training, so I think a lot about the topic of feedback and helping people grow and develop. Here at Rhabit, I try to implement this in our products, make sure that they're all working in a scientifically sound way, and also, at the same time, make sense to the user, make sense to the consumer of our product. Before working for Rhabit, I spent a good bit of time as a consultant, working with clients, implementing all kinds of complex talent management solutions, and I also spent a good bit in R&D. So that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to hear more from you about the topic of feedback, which is the center of our discussion today. So to kick things off, there's a lot of talk about feedback these days. And I'm curious from both of you, what you think is the value of creating a good feedback program. And let's start with David on this one.
Sure. I mean, really simply, I think creating a great feedback program, which we'll talk about the term feedback, I think, a little later, but it's really all about development and growth. If we can be honest with each other and have really productive conversations around one, what we really appreciate about one another and what we do really well and we're really great at, we tend to get more of that from each other, which is really powerful. And then also we all have areas to grow. So when we can share that in a meaningful and caring way, we all can get better together. So it's, I think in the spirit of continuous improvement, there's huge impact in having a great feedback program.
Yeah, it's definitely around improvement. When we kick our product off with clients, when we teach people how to use Rhabit, we have this little snippet. It's like 3 minutes long on why feedback is important. What we do is we show the picture of an old-timey experimenter, guy with Bunsen burners and Erlenmeyer flasks and stuff like that, and we say, we all, as humans, are like natural experimenters. That's how we learn a ton of stuff. We try something, it works great. If it doesn't work, we probably try something again. We tinker, we tweak, we tune. So we learn from our mistakes. We learn through trial and error. But of course, we have to have, the technical term is an error signal in engineering, and normal human beings would call this feedback. But if we don't have this feedback, we cannot use this enormous, brain that we're carrying around with ourselves and use this. So for me, it's almost a component of tragedy when people don't get feedback, because without this feedback, we cannot experiment, we cannot learn, we cannot try things out. We're kind of doomed to repeat the same thing over and over. So for improvement and changes and getting better personal and professional growth, it's just absolutely critical to get feedback.
Yeah, given the central role that both of you feel feedback plays in organizations, it's really important that people get it right? And so I'm also curious to hear more from you about what you think it is that people are getting wrong. Why does feedback fail? This is such a core component to us as human beings, as well as to employees. So why do you think feedback fails? And David, do you want to start off again?
Sure. I think there are a number of reasons. I'll pick one of them because I'll go with a recency bias because I was literally just having this conversation with my wife this morning. Not feedback with one another. That's a whole nother feedback in a marriage is probably a whole nother topic. But we both work for Google in full transparency. And we were talking about our experience with feedback at Google, and there's an opportunity to provide upward feedback to a manager during every performance management cycle here every 6 months. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about how that's actually kind of broken. And Google is refreshing that process, but she was actually referring to her experience at American Express, where they have an entirely anonymous 360 process that happens with every perf cycle. And she said that she found that to be so incredibly rich because the anonymity of it and the 360 nature allowed people to be really candid in a safe way. And people stayed with positive intent in their feedback, but were still able to give more constructive insights to leaders. And it was just, she found it to be far more valuable. And so that's, I think anonymity is actually a really powerful thing that not everyone gets right.
And the Google model that you said is a little bumpy. It is not anonymous. Is that right?
That's correct. And what we find is that the scores that managers get, there's a quantitative and a qualitative nature to it. And upward feedback, the averages are in the high 80s and 90s on every item we ask people to rate their managers on. Mm-hmm. And I think we have great managers here, so that is part of it. Mm-hmm. But there's very little variability in the feedback, which means we're just not always getting the full story.
Yep. Yeah. And it's once a year, right? So this is not a...
It's twice per year.
Twice per year, okay.
Yeah, it's twice per year. But I think, the lack of anonymity, and then also the fact that it's embedded in our performance management process, I also think takes a high degree of safety out of it, both for giving the feedback, because you could have constructive feedback for your manager, but you still think they're great, and you don't want to tank their performance review. And then also you're more defensive when you're receiving that feedback, if it's impacting your perf rating and thereby your compensation, than if it's really more about development.
Yeah, I think I would imagine combining like administrative things like benefits, bonuses, compensation, all of that stuff with the idea of feedback, I think has to backfire, right? Because even if you're not maybe the biggest fan of your boss, do you really want to spit in their soup, so to speak, and ruin their day and know that maybe they will retaliate? So that's where the anonymity comes back in. But even if you're not worried about this, you don't want to be the person that messes with somebody's livelihood. So I think that puts a lot of burden on the feedback provider to not worry about these things. So
And just one more thing there, like you can also love your boss and think they're amazing and still have really valuable constructive feedback for them, which means you're even less likely to provide it if you think it's going to potentially reflect negatively on them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Feedback is this really broad term that we are, using for so many different things. And the context of performance management, it's more corrective, it's more evaluative. In other contexts, it's maybe more, benign about, trying to help people grow professionally. So I'm always wondering if it would make sense to kind of just have different terms for feedback, different types of feedback, instead of lumping this all together into the same thing. I'm getting more and more skeptical. It's something different to everybody.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about that, Alexander? Because I think the word feedback can really have several different meanings. I'm curious to hear if you think we should even call feedback, as you're mentioning, or should we break it down into different categories?
I don't know. That's really difficult. I think I would probably be happy if we can split it from the annual performance review. If there's feedback that is used for development, where it is common and normal for a manager to sit down, or not just for a manager, but for others as well. Going back to David's idea of the true 360 nature of feedback. If that is done right, you can learn so much about yourself, and you can try things out. Maybe once in a while, try out a different behavior for fit and see how it works, see if it makes a difference. And if you get feedback on that, you can then, again, going back to my idea of tinkering and tweaking and tuning, see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you try something else. So I'm not sure. I'm curious what David is thinking. Maybe some new terms need to be coined, some new words need to be used other than feedback. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it is what it is, but it'd be great to find a different term. I mean, just think about when someone says, "Can I give you some feedback?" How do you? I mean, probably just all got tense on this call just hearing. There goes that cortisol. But I think at a minimum, to your point, Alexander, being more specific about what the feedback is. I think what even might have started us on the path of this webinar was thinking about the really simple framework in the book, Thanks for the Feedback.
Mm-hmm.
There's evaluative feedback, which is basically, how are you doing in your role? Are you meeting expectations and at the level that is expected of you given, your hierarchy in the organization? There's developmental feedback, which is about, regardless of how high up you are or how good you are, what's next for you and what could you get better at? We all have in that. And then there's recognition, which is a form of feedback and absolutely critical to helping people know what they're doing well and feeling great about their work and engagement and those sorts of things. And so letting people know exactly what type of feedback they're going to get, and then doing those at the right time in the right way when it's expected, is really, I think, what folks need to get focus on.
And not mixing it, right? I mean, I'm just going to say it once and then we can let it go. We don't have to debate it. The feedback sandwich, right? Where you also known by other less flattering terms, where you give appreciation and say, "Ah, you did a really good job here," and usually it's vague and not very descriptive, and then you use that opportunity to deliver some, probably unfavorable and evaluative feedback, and then you use some more positive feedback. And of course, people hate that, and you basically condition your own employees so that every time they hear something positive, they assume, okay, this is just a vehicle, right, to deliver some negative feedback, and they just probably start hating to talk to you altogether. So for me, this is combining these things, labeling them, teasing them apart would be fantastic. And a lot of our thinking around product design goes exactly toward that, where we have praise in one area and the other stuff entirely somewhere else, separating it out. But yeah, I would almost be happy if praise and appreciation and corrective feedback or evaluative feedback are not served in the same meal, basically.
And think about the average performance management process in any company, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a form of all three in nearly every perf process, and so you're naturally getting a sandwich. Sometimes it's a sandwich, sometimes it's an open-faced sandwich. You never know what you're going to get.
Sometimes it's low carb and there's nothing positive at all.
That's really tough. So it's carving it out the right way, I think, is really important.
I love the idea of a low carb. I never heard that before, but that's a good metaphor. I think that you're highlighting is that positive feedback serves a really critical function and negative feedback serves a critical function. And we need both, but we need to do it in a less traditional way than we've been doing because it's not serving the purpose that we want it to serve. I remember the very worst class that I ever took in my life was an extremely difficult statistics course. And we had 2 assignments due each week. And the faculty member that taught the course didn't give us our graded assignments back until the end of the semester. We got them back in bulk. And what ended up happening was it was extremely demotivating over the course of the semester because we didn't know how we were doing. Actually, some of us were doing quite well on the assignments, had no idea. So it became very demotivating over time because we didn't get any positive feedback. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us had made habits out of really negative things that then accumulated over time that then we were unable to actually fix in the moment. So what ended up happening was we had made the same mistake over and over. And by the time we got the feedback, now we were so used to doing it, we had to undo those habits that we had put in place. So we were both missing the motivating factor of getting the positive feedback to keep going, and also the developmental feature of getting the feedback of where we were going wrong so that we could course correct. And so I think a lot of, when I hear about feedback woes in the workplace as well, a lot of my thinking goes back to that, that experience that I had with sort of getting this bulk feedback. And that's generally how we do it at work, but it's not really the best way.
Yeah, I mean, if the annual performance review, no matter how often it has been described as being dead and, you know, companies not using it anymore, I mean, there's still probably more companies doing annual, maybe semi-annual performance reviews than there are not doing them. So there's still this practice of letting people go in the wrong direction for a long period of time before you give that corrective feedback. And then, you know, again, to our earlier point, you combine it with, you know, all kinds of other threatening things like compensation and bonuses in the same conversation. So there's, it's almost like we designed this process to be wrong, right? To be inefficient and threatening and so forth. There's, yeah, but it could be done worse, basically.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, Alexander, actually. What do you think are ways that talent leaders could capture objective feedback data so that their program is enabling and empowering them to actually take the data they have, turn it into action, and help people to get better at what they do? Yeah,
so I'm a little bit biased. A little known fact: we build software around this. I'm just kidding. But one thing we do try here is we try to put the manager basically into a very different role, where they are not the judge, jury, and executioner that comes into a meeting and says, "Hey, I think you are not assertive enough in meetings. So I think you are sometimes doing sloppy work." The moment they deliver that, they are sending this huge ball of difficult to digest messages to the feedback provider. We're trying to tease this apart. And the way we do it, we give this 360 ongoing feedback in which people evaluate these behaviors. For example, are you on time for meetings, or is your work quality good? So we let the feedback process run through software and people interacting with the software, and then the manager can step in with the data and collaboratively, and this is really important, develop solutions. So if there's any way that managers just generally can step in more like the coach that brings a game tape and says, "Hey, here's something that I would like to discuss with you and problem solve," that takes the dynamic to a different level and puts managers into a role where they are not seen as the supervisor, the disciplinarian, but maybe somebody employees can trust and you know, get true help from. So it's easier said than done, but I mean that's the uphill battle we're fighting, right? How do we do that? That's it's not easy.
I love that frame so much, and for two reasons. One, as you described it, basically putting the manager on the side of the employee. Like that's really powerful, and that's ultimately what a manager is there for.
Right.
And Google's actually done the research to understand what managers can do, and be a great coach is one of the primary things. And you have to be on the same side. And so I love how you frame that, Alexander. The second piece is with Rhabit and the 360 nature of it. I find there can be a lot of pressure on a manager to be a sole provider of feedback when the manager often isn't there for the work.
Right.
And one, I think you just have to be intentional about being with your folks in situations where you can then have an opportunity to provide feedback on something very specific, but also to kind of crowdsource that and get it from the folks that they're interacting with every day is absolutely the best way to do it. And then you're not, to your point, you're not working off your own assumptions or preferences as a manager. You're actually getting feedback directly from the people that are most equipped to provide it.
Right. Yeah. And what I think one of the biggest opportunities of 360 feedback is, and this is just generally true for 360-degree feedback, is that the feedback providers are in their role as a provider of feedback are not only delivering information, they're also learning something from the process if it's done right. If I give feedback on my manager creates an inclusive environment, makes me feel that I belong at this company, makes me feel like my voice is being heard here, not only am I giving feedback, I'm also learning that this is something that is of value to the organization. So there's almost killing two birds with one stone. So it's I think if it's done right, it's a way to implement a cultural shift in the organization in the long run. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really hitting on this two-way street process feedback, that it's not just about the person that's receiving the feedback, but also the person that's giving the feedback, and that folks can engage in this process in a way that's much more productive than what we've traditionally thought about, which I really like. Once people have this data or have these insights, how can they take the insights that they've gathered from the data and apply it to talent programs? So what can we do to actually improve our organizations as a result of having improved feedback processes?
I have some thoughts, but David, do you want to respond to this one?
Over to you. You're the expert working with it every day. I'd love to hear how you've seen people use the tool.
We have for me, the magic is in aggregation. So the individual can use the tool and can use the feedback to just make changes. And this could be just well-delivered informal feedback from somebody that you receive. It doesn't have to be part of a larger program or something, but the individual can always change. I think something that is fascinating that can happen once you collect feedback systematically over time and across various levels and roles, you can start aggregating the data, especially if you have quantitative data, right? If you have written feedback, that's sometimes not bad because it gives you a lot of context. It can also be tricky to write, but overall, maybe there's value in it. But if you have numerical, like numbers, basically, right? Quantitative data that you can aggregate, that you can look at and visualize, you can now build an understanding of your organization as a whole to understand, are there systemic issues in my organization? Are there pockets of poor leadership? Are there pockets in the organization where engagement is low? And does this connect to poor leaders? Is there a statistical relationship, or any relationship for that matter, between the quality of your leaders and how people are experiencing work? And once you have that, you can look for cause and effect relationships, right? You can say, okay, I'm going to invest a little bit more in training here so that the quality of the leadership is better, so that turnover goes down. So once you can connect these variables, we see human resource professionals, talent managers, move from being just doing their job as talent managers. They start thinking strategically, how can we influence this in the future? What levers do we need to push so that all of this takes shape, not tomorrow or not the day after tomorrow, but maybe in a couple of months or in half a year and so forth. So that's the beauty that I see coming from that.
And if I can just give you a plug for how powerful I think that is, because at Google, since we're not using a tool like Rhabit, unfortunately, what we're finding is actually that data is lacking, because we have this data that's tied to perf that comes in every 6 months and really just all looks the same. And actually, in my role in people analytics, I'm constantly getting asked, like, where should we focus on manager development? What should we be doing? And we don't have a great quantitative answer because we don't have the clean, candid data that a really solid process and the right technology to enable that process can help you collect.
Yeah, if you're not able to gather information on how people are performing, and you had mentioned before, David, the lack of variability in some of the performance data that you get when people know that it's being used for administrative purposes, you can't make good decisions about who's actually performing well, or to find those pockets where things are either not working well or pockets where things are working so well. And you want to learn what's going well in this area. It's difficult to locate those pockets that need some extra attention, or could be used as a great exemplar if the data looks similar across the board. So that variability becomes really important for the predictive analytics part of things that Alexander is speaking about as well. So I'd like to turn it over to some audience questions. So anybody who has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. The first one that I'm going to kick off with here is, what are your thoughts on radical candor?
Go ahead, Alexander.
I've have strong feelings about it. I'm not a big fan of it. Just to summarize, maybe for the audience and those who are not familiar with radical candor, Kim Scott came up with it, and to her merit, she used this to move the concept of feedback into the discussion. So that's great, and I love it. It's not at that stage. I think it's a couple of years old by now, and not a lot of people were talking about feedback. But what she said basically, you have to deliver feedback directly, challenge directly. That's one axis. And at the same time, you have to care personally. So when you care personally and challenge directly, that is radical candor. So this is the sweet spot of feedback. The problem that I have with it, she creates a little bit of a straw man argument in the sense that all of the other types of feedback, to me, they are not feedback. That's being a terrible human being and being deceptive and so forth. That's what she labels it, but nobody would have ever argued that this is actually feedback, right? So this, when you look at her definition in the end, she says feedback needs to be honest, and it has to be delivered with a sense of care. So those are the whats, right? So she describes this is what feedback should be like. What I'm struggling with is she doesn't explain how. This is killing me because I have clients that say we need to enable all of our managers to deliver great feedback. But the question is, how do we do this? How do we build this personal care? And how do we deliver this directly? So this is my, it's a fantastic presentation. If you haven't seen it on YouTube, it's a TED Talk that is definitely worth watching, but I just felt it was lacking more pragmatic aspects. I'm curious what David is thinking.
Yeah, for me, I think it's really about how radical candor is morphed. I think this notion of being direct and having really high levels of care for the person you're delivering this feedback to, I think it's spot on. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of folks out there that kind of dismiss the personal care piece, or they mistake caring about the individual with caring about like the situation and actually what their own needs are.
Yeah.
And then if you don't have that authentic care for someone that you've built up in a long-term relationship with that person through being supportive and all of these other things, then radical candor by its nature just can't happen. And so I think the concept is fine. It's just the complexity of that personal care piece is super, super challenging. And what most leaders miss, I think. And quite frankly, just isn't a part of the business culture in the United States in most companies. And that's where I think Kim came from Google, and that's present here. Like I can, I can tell you that that's here, and it's valued. So it is a different environment. And without that, you can't have a radical candor.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, it seems like part of what you're saying relates to feedback in general, which is that it needs to be specific and behavioral and really get into the nitty gritty of what people are supposed to do. And it feels like what you're saying is that this concept doesn't have a lot of the how behind it. It has a lot of maybe a definition of what you're supposed to be approaching feedback with a certain attitude, but not a lot of how you get there.
Exactly. Yeah. She gives the example. She delivers a presentation to the most senior leaders, like Eric Schmidt at Google, and apparently she kills it. But her supervisor takes her by the side and says, "You said a lot in the presentation, and that made you sound stupid and lacking confidence," or something. I'm paraphrasing, but she definitely said stupid in the talk, and that is, if you want to challenge directly, that's fine. But there are other ways you could have delivered that are less threatening to somebody's self-esteem and ego. You could have said, you don't have a lot of credibility when you do that. Certainly, maybe this was the right thing for this particular person, for Kim Scott, who probably is like a super talented and great executive. but maybe in other situations you cannot do that, and this is where I'm lacking, where I'm missing guidance, right? Where's the personal care, to David's point? It has to build up over time. It's a trusting relationship. You have to do it outside of the feedback conversation. It doesn't happen during feedback. I feel like when you give somebody feedback, you are in the interpersonal bank account that you build with people over time. When you give somebody negative feedback, you're withdrawing something, right? You make a withdrawal from that. And if you haven't paid in over time into this trust bank account, so to speak, you cannot do that. It doesn't come overnight. None of that is. Every time somebody has a 2x2 model of the world, I get skeptical because it's simplifying things just a little bit too much. I don't know. So.
Yeah, I think that this is all wonderful, and the idea that we need to be really paying attention to how we're doing feedback so that we do it well. It can't be an afterthought. It has to really be a thoughtful process that's motivating and gives people feedback on what they're doing well, where they need improvement, and actually strives to develop performance in the organization to higher levels. So this has been an awesome conversation. I have learned so much from both of you, David and Alexander, and I know the folks listening have as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And well, thanks for moderating and guiding us. Are we out of time? I'm going to check with Ashton and Hillary, or we out of time? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
This flew by. I can't believe we're already done.
Yeah.
I wish we had a little bit more time.
Real-time feedback, out of time.
That's our feedback. We're done.
All right,
Awesome.
thanks everybody. The recording will be shared at the end of today, as well as a few other little documents that we have to provide. And I just want to thank everyone that attended, Katina, David, for joining us. And if that's all, then I'll go ahead and end the session.
Awesome.
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.